There is a kind of silence that does not feel like peace. I have lived long enough to know the difference. I have sat in rooms where silence was generous, the kind that settles after a good meal, after a long laugh, after someone says exactly the right thing and nobody needs to add anything more. I have also sat in rooms where silence was something else entirely, something stretched too thin, something that the people inside it were working very hard to maintain. That Sunday, in my son's house on Compass Hill, the silence was the second kind, and it took me the entire afternoon to admit that to myself. My name is Margaret O'Sullivan. I am 79 years old. I taught literature at University College Cork for 31 years, and if that discipline gave me anything beyond a deep love for the written word, it gave me this: the ability to notice when a story has a hidden architecture, when the surface of things is not the same as the structure beneath. I spent decades teaching students to look beneath the language, to feel where a sentence was doing more work than it appeared to be doing, to hear what was not said as clearly as what was. I should have applied that skill sooner that Sunday, but perhaps I simply did not want to. I want to be honest about that. When we love people, we often choose not to see. Not because we are foolish. Because seeing carries responsibility, and there are moments in a long life when you are simply too tired to carry anything more. But the note found me anyway. That is how I think of it now. Not that I found the note. The note found me, tucked into the pocket of my wool coat, folded with the particular care of someone who had decided, after a very long time, that silence was no longer serving any of them. I want to tell you exactly how that afternoon began, because the beginning matters more than I understood at the time. Kinsale in late October is a particular kind of beautiful. It is not the soft postcard beauty of summer, when the harbor fills with visiting boats and the restaurants along the waterfront compete cheerfully with their window boxes and their chalkboard menus. October Kinsale is quieter and more honest than that. The hills above the town go amber and rust. The fishing boats sit lower in the water, weighted with the serious business of the season. The Georgian facades along the streets, those extraordinary painted houses in their terracotta and mustard and deep blue, seem to absorb the gray Atlantic light and hold it inside their walls like something preserved. I have lived in this town for most of my adult life. My husband Cormac and I came here when Declan was still young, and we never left. Cormac has been gone 11 years now, and in those 11 years I have made a private agreement with myself to remain observant, to keep my eyes open, to notice what he would have noticed. He was extraordinarily good at noticing things, not in a suspicious way, but in the way of a man who genuinely loved the world and paid it the compliment of his attention. I like to think I carry that forward for both of us now. The walk up Compass Hill that Sunday morning took me longer than it once did. I am not going to pretend otherwise. My knees inform me of my age with increasing emphasis each year, and the hill is steeper than memory suggests. I wore my good wool coat, the charcoal gray one with the deep pockets that Cormac bought me the winter before he became ill. I have kept it well. It still fits. Some things are worth maintaining. Declan's house is a wide, confident structure, the kind of house that seems to have been standing there since before anyone thought to question it. It was built in the early part of the 19th century and has the thick-walled solidity of that era. Small, deep-set windows, a generous front step worn smooth by generations of footfall, and inside, the particular smell that old Irish houses carry. Turf smoke absorbed into plaster across many decades, beeswax on the wooden floors, and beneath it all, the faint mineral suggestion of the sea. Declan opened the door before I had finished climbing the step. He does that. He always has. It is one of the things about him that still moves me. This attentiveness, this care. He is 57 years old, my son, and he has the particular distinguished appearance of a man who takes himself seriously without taking himself too seriously. Silver at his temples now, the same dark eyes as his father. When he smiles, a real smile, not the polite one he sometimes deploys in professional situations. It starts in his eyes before it reaches his mouth, and it is entirely Cormac's smile, and it still catches me off guard all these years later. "Ma'am." He took my arm at the elbow, the old-fashioned way. "You should have rung. I would have walked down to meet you." "I walked up a hill for 30 years before you were born," I told him. "I think I can still manage Compass Hill on a Sunday morning." He laughed, and for that first moment, everything felt exactly as it always had. Siobhan was in the kitchen. I could hear her moving before I saw her, the particular rhythm of her in a domestic space, purposeful and unhurried at the same time. She appeared at the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a linen cloth, and she smiled when she saw me, and it was a warm smile, a genuine one, and yet. Even then, in that first moment, something registered somewhere behind my eyes, something my mind filed quietly away without yet knowing what to do with it. Siobhan is 54 years old, a woman of considerable composure and considerable intelligence, and she smiles in a way that is always precisely calibrated to the situation. I have known her for 28 years, and I admire her enormously, which is why I can say this clearly. That Sunday morning, for just a fraction of a second before the warmth arrived in her expression, I saw something else, something careful, something that had been waiting for me to come through the door. Then the warmth landed, and she came forward, and she kissed my cheek, and she said something about the lamb, how it had been marinating since the night before, how she hoped I was hungry, and everything moved forward quite normally. The dining room was prepared with the particular elegance Siobhan brings to these occasions without ever making them feel stiff. White linen, the good crystal they were given as a wedding gift and actually use, which I have always appreciated. A low arrangement of late garden flowers, chrysanthemum and a few brave late roses, in a green ceramic bowl at the center of the table. Candles, unlit at midday, set out more as a gesture than an intention. I sat in the chair I always sit in, the one at the right-hand side that gives me a view through the window toward the garden wall, and, beyond it, the suggestion of the harbor below. The light that afternoon was particular, the kind that falls in October when the clouds shift and the sun arrives at a low angle so that everything it touches looks simultaneously illuminated and nostalgic. Declan poured me a small glass of Bordeaux without asking, because he knows my preference. We talked about the harbor development the county council had been considering. Declan had opinions, measured ones, based on what he had seen in his years dealing with marine insurance across the southwest coast. We talked about the restoration project that Siobhan's charitable trust was completing in Timoleague, a cluster of old fishermen's cottages that had been acquired and were being brought back to habitable condition. Siobhan described it briefly, practically the way she always describes her work, without sentimentality, but with an unmistakable underlying care. The lamb was extraordinary. I told her so. She received the compliment with a small nod that managed to be modest without being dismissive. And the conversation continued. And all of it was perfectly pleasant. And all of it was, in some way I could not yet name, slightly off. It is very difficult to explain what I mean by that without sounding like I am manufacturing significance after the fact. I am aware that is a risk. When something remarkable happens, there is always the temptation to look back and construct a narrative in which all the signs were there, in which everything pointed toward what eventually occurred. I want to resist that temptation. I want to be accurate. So let me be precise about what I actually noticed, in real time, that Sunday afternoon. The first thing I noticed was that Declan talked more than usual. Not nervously, he is not a nervous man, but with a kind of purposeful continuity that, in retrospect, I understand differently than I did at the time. He moved the conversation along with an ease that was just slightly too practiced. Whenever a natural pause arrived, he filled it. Not intrusively, very naturally. But it had the effect, the very particular effect, of making it difficult for anyone else to redirect the conversation. The second thing I noticed was Siobhan's eyes. Twice during the meal, I caught her looking at me with an expression that belonged to a different kind of moment than the one we were in. Not distress, not urgency. Something more like the expression of a person who has made a decision and is waiting for the appropriate circumstance to act on it. She is not a demonstrative woman. She keeps her interior life carefully, but in 28 years of shared Sunday lunches and family celebrations and the kind of ordinary intimacy that accumulates between a woman and her daughter-in-law, I have learned to read her. And what I read that afternoon was waiting. The third thing I noticed came later, during the clearing of the plates, when Siobhan rose from the table and I rose to help her, as I always do. And Declan said, with perfect pleasantness, "Ma'am, sit, I'll help Siobhan." And he moved to the kitchen with the easy authority of a man who was simply being helpful, which is entirely possible, which is what I told myself. But Siobhan had paused for just a half-second before Declan stood. And in that half-second, before she composed her expression into its usual calm, I saw something shift across her face. Disappointment. Very briefly, very quietly, like a door that opened an inch and was then, very gently, closed again. We had coffee afterward in the sitting room. The old sitting room with its original cornicing and its deep fireplace where Declan keeps a proper turf fire in the colder months. It was lit that afternoon, the peat smell warm and particular, and I sat in the wingback chair that had been Cormac's and watched the fire and listened to my son and my daughter-in-law talk about a harbor dinner they were attending the following week, and I thought, I am imagining all of this. I am a woman of 79 who has read too much fiction and spent too many years looking for the hidden architecture in things. I am imposing a pattern on an ordinary Sunday afternoon because I am old enough that ordinary Sundays feel precious and I want them to mean something. That is what I told myself. And perhaps I believed it. The afternoon ended as it always does. Declan brought my coat from the hall. Siobhan came from the kitchen where she had been setting things to rights, and she walked with me to the door, and she helped me on with my coat the way you help an elderly woman with a coat. Carefully, gently, making sure the collar sat properly, her hands briefly at my shoulders. Their hands touch for only a second. Nothing unusual is said. That is the truth of it. There was no meaningful glance, no whispered word, no signal I could have identified in that moment as significant. She smoothed the collar of my coat, and she said the drive home would be cold, and I should ring when I arrived, and I said I would, and Declan kissed my cheek, and I went down the front step and along the path, and I did not look back. The taxi I had arranged was waiting at the bottom of the hill. The driver was a quiet man from Bandon who had driven me before and knew that I preferred not to be talked at on a journey. The evening was coming in fast, as it does in late October on the Cork coast, that abrupt maritime dark that falls like a decision. The harbor lights came on as we descended through the town. The old fort on Summer Cove caught the last of the sky on its stone walls, that particular blue-gray that exists only in those last minutes before the light entirely surrenders. I was home by 5:30. I made a pot of tea. I put on the lamp in the study. I had a new biography of Elizabeth Bowen that I had been meaning to begin, and I sat in my chair with it, and I read 3 pages, and I could not have told you a single sentence of them afterward. I was still thinking about Siobhan's face during those 3 plates being carried to the kitchen, about Declan's hand resting on the conversation like a man keeping a door from opening in a wind. I am imagining things, I told myself again, and then I reached into the pocket of my coat, not for any particular reason, simply the absent-minded habit of reaching into a coat pocket, and my fingers found the folded paper. I did not know immediately what it was. My first thought, genuinely, was that it was a receipt from a previous outing. I have a habit of leaving things in pockets, which Cormac found endlessly amusing. I drew it out without urgency and unfolded it under the lamp. It was a single sheet of notepaper, the kind Siobhan uses, cream-colored, medium weight, the texture of something chosen deliberately. The writing was hers. I know her hand well. Careful, Upright, a schoolmistress's clarity applied to a woman who simply values precision in all things. One sentence. Please look inside the blue file in the cedar cabinet before anyone else does. I read it twice. Then I set it on the arm of the chair. Then I looked at it for a very long time. There was no signature, no date, no explanation, no context, no instruction beyond that single sentence. She had not written my name at the top. She had not written anything else at the bottom. Just those 19 words, set down in that clear and careful hand, on cream notepaper, folded once, and placed inside the pocket of my wool coat, at some moment I had not perceived during a Sunday afternoon that had seemed on its surface entirely ordinary. Please look inside the blue file in the cedar cabinet before anyone else does. I knew the cedar cabinet. It stands in the study of the Compass Hill house, a tall old piece, dark-stained, with brass fittings that have gone soft with age. Cormac and I had found it at an estate sale in Macroom many years ago. When Declan and Siobhan took the house, after Cormac died and I moved to the smaller place on Friar Street, we had left many things behind, and the cedar cabinet was one of them. I had always thought of it as part of the house rather than part of our furniture. Fixed, settled, as permanent as the walls. I had no idea what blue file she meant. I do not make a habit of going through my son's home files, and I would not do so uninvited, and yet the note was an invitation. Careful, private, encoded in a single sentence, before anyone else does. Those 4 words were the ones that settled something in my chest like a stone settling into still water. Not fear, not quite. Something quieter than fear and more serious than unease. She had given me a task, and she had asked me to complete it before someone, she did not say who, completed it differently. I sat with that sentence until the fire I had lit burned down to ash, and the biography of Elizabeth Bowen sat unread on the table beside me, and the harbor below the town went entirely quiet. I did not sleep well that night. I kept returning to the afternoon in memory, not with panic, but with the particular forensic attention of a woman who spent 3 decades teaching other people how to read carefully, who had spent a lifetime believing that the most important things in a story are rarely the loudest ones. I went back through the meal, the conversation, the small moments I had noticed and half dismissed. I thought about the way Declan had moved through that afternoon with such smooth, seamless purpose. I thought about the door that had opened a crack in Siobhan's expression and been quietly, firmly closed. And I thought about the cedar cabinet, about the blue file, about what kind of document a careful, private, deeply principled woman like Siobhan O'Sullivan would consider important enough to risk. Because it was a risk. I understood that. She had made a decision that could complicate everything between her and her husband, between her and me, between all of us, to slip a handwritten note into her mother-in-law's coat pocket on an October Sunday afternoon. I did not open the note again that night. I left it on the arm of the chair. But I knew, by the time the harbor finally went silent below my window and the October dark was entirely complete, that I would go back to Compass Hill. I would go back in the morning when I knew they would both be at the fundraising breakfast at the harbor, the one Declan had mentioned during coffee, the one Siobhan had confirmed they were both attending from 8:30 until noon. I had perhaps 3 hours. I would let myself in with the key I have kept since Cormac's time. They have never asked for it back, and I have never thought to offer it. And I would go to the study, and I would find the cedar cabinet, and I would open it, and I would find the blue file. And I would read whatever Siobhan believed I needed to read before anyone else had the chance to decide, on my behalf, what I should or should not know. 79 years old, and a note in my coat pocket, and one sentence rearranging everything I thought I understood about an ordinary Sunday. I lay in the dark, and I thought, Cormac would have gone that same evening. I would wait until morning. But I was already, in the most essential part of myself, entirely awake. I have always believed that the most consequential decisions of a life are not made in dramatic moments. They are made in quiet ones, In the space between waking and rising, in the minute you spend standing at a window, watching rain move across a harbor before you have spoken a single word to anyone. The decision to return to Compass Hill was made somewhere in that territory. Not with resolution exactly, not with any grand sense of purpose. More the way a tide turns, not because it has chosen to, but because that is simply what it does, because the forces that govern it have already done their work, and what you see on the surface is only the final expression of something that was decided much further down. I was awake before 5. The bedroom in my house on Friar Street faces east, and in October, the light arrives tentatively at first, a graying of the dark rather than a proper dawn. And I lay watching it for a long time before I allowed myself to think clearly about what I intended to do. I did not feel like a woman on the edge of something, that is important to say. There is a version of this story in which I was frightened, or thrilled, or gripped by some cinematic urgency that drove me out of bed with dramatic speed. That is not the truth. The truth is that I lay under my quilt with the note folded on the bedside table where I had moved it before sleeping, and I felt, more than anything else, an old professional feeling. The feeling I used to get before a seminar in which I knew the text would reveal something that most of my students had not yet seen. A kind of quiet readiness. Not excitement. Readiness. I rose at 6:30. I made porridge and ate it standing at the kitchen window, watching the rooftops below me emerge from the dark into a muted October morning. The harbor was invisible from my kitchen, but I could hear it, or I imagined I could, which in Kinsale amounts to much the same thing. The particular quality of silence that a fishing harbor produces on a weekday morning when the boats have already gone out and the water is settling back into itself. I dressed carefully. Not formally. I was not making a social call, and I was well aware of the ambiguous nature of what I was about to do. I chose practical clothes. The gray wool coat again, because it was cold, and because the coat, by this point, felt relevant. I kept the note in my hand rather than my pocket as I walked up the hill. I do not know why. Perhaps simply to remind myself that I was not inventing this, that the 19 words were real, the cream notepaper was real. The decision had already been made by someone else before I made mine. Compass Hill at 7:45 in the morning has a different quality to it than Compass Hill at noon on a Sunday. The light falls differently on the painted facades. At that hour, on an overcast October morning, the colors seem almost internal, as though the houses are illuminated from within rather than without. The mustard and the terracotta and the deep slate blue of the neighboring properties have always struck me as specifically Irish in their defiance, this insistence on color against gray weather, this refusal to be muted by Atlantic cloud. I let myself in with my key. The lock turned with the ease of a mechanism that knows a familiar hand. The hall was quiet, in the way a house is quiet when the people who fill it have recently left. Not the deep quiet of a long, empty building, but a provisional quiet, warm, with the residue of habitation. Declan's outdoor jacket hung on the hook beside the door. 2 pairs of boots stood neatly on the mat. The smell of their breakfast, toast, coffee, something with butter, still moved gently through the downstairs air. I stood for a moment in the hall. Even then, even standing inside my son's house alone with a handwritten note from his wife in my coat pocket, I paused. Not from guilt, exactly. Something more considered than guilt. I am a woman who has spent a life believing that other people's privacy is a serious thing, that it deserves genuine respect, not the performative kind that people offer while finding ways around it, but the real kind, the kind that costs you something. Chauvin had given me permission. More than permission. She had extended an invitation with a very particular urgency encoded in its final 4 words. Before anyone else does. I folded the note once more and put it in my pocket, and I walked down the hallway toward the study. The cedar cabinet stood exactly where it had always stood, against the far wall of the study, between the 2 tall windows that overlooked the back garden. It is a handsome piece of furniture. Dark-stained wood, almost black in certain lights, with a grain that runs in long, even lines that Cormac used to trace with his finger sometimes when he was thinking. The brass fittings have darkened beautifully with age, not neglect, but the kind of patina that comes from decades of careful handling. 4 drawers below, 2 cabinet doors above, and inside the upper section, a series of deep shelves where Declan keeps the older records and files from his consultancy work, organized in the methodical way of a man who distrusts disorder. I opened the upper cabinet doors. There were files arranged vertically on the shelves, their spines facing outward in various colors: burgundy, cream, dark green, one in a faded brown. I moved along them slowly, reading the labels in Declan's handwriting, which is larger and more expressive than Chauvin's, the hand of a man who writes quickly. The blue file was on the second shelf, not hidden, not buried behind other things, positioned in the row with the others, but set slightly to the left of where it would naturally have fallen in the alphabetical arrangement he used for the rest, as though it had been placed there deliberately outside the system, as though someone wanted it findable without making it obvious. I lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than I expected. Not with the dense weight of legal documents, I have handled enough of those in my time, but with the layered weight of a collection of different materials, different papers, different ages. The cover was a plain blue card, the kind sold in office supply shops, and across it, in a hand I did not immediately recognize, were written 3 words: Harbor Road Trust. I stood there holding it for a moment before I took it to the desk. Declan's desk is an old partner's desk, oak, which had been his father's before him. Cormac had used it in the study of our previous house, and Declan had claimed it when we moved, and I had never begrudged him it, because I had always thought it suited him, this solid, double-sided thing that implies collaboration and permanence simultaneously. I sat in Declan's chair and set the blue file on the desk before me and opened it. The first thing I found was not a document. It was an envelope, unsealed, containing 3 photographs. Older photographs, the kind printed on the slightly glossy paper of 40 years ago. The colors shifted toward amber with time. I drew them out and looked at them carefully. The first photograph showed a building I recognized, though it took me a moment to place it. A stone structure near the water, long and low, with arched windows on the ground floor and a narrow upper story. The paint on the exterior was badly weathered, the window frames rotten, the front step cracked. Beside the building, a handwritten sign on a wooden post, too small in the photograph to read completely. But I could make out enough: the word pier. And below it, something ending in road. The second photograph showed the same building in what appeared to be a later state, not restored, but partially worked on. Scaffolding on the eastern wall. A tarpaulin covering the roof at one end. 2 men standing in front, looking not at the camera but at each other, in the posture of people in the middle of a serious conversation. I studied those 2 men for a long time. One of them I did not know. The other was my husband, Cormac O'Sullivan. Younger than I had seen him in many years of memory. He must have been in his early 40s in this photograph, which would place it somewhere in the late 1980s. He was wearing the green wax jacket he had owned for years, the one he replaced reluctantly when the zipper finally gave up entirely. He was thinner than I remembered him being in that period, and he was standing with the posture of a man who was carrying something, not literally, not in that moment, but in his body, in the set of his shoulders, in the particular angle of his attention toward the man beside him. The third photograph was of the interior of a different building, an office, or a solicitor's room, the kind of space with shelved walls and a long, narrow table. Around the table, 5 people. Cormac again. The unknown man from the second photograph. 2 women I did not recognize. And at the far end of the table, in a chair turned slightly sideways, a younger woman with the unmistakable composed bearing of someone I have known for 28 years. A much younger Chauvin, 30 years younger perhaps, before she was Chauvin O'Sullivan, before she was my daughter-in-law, before she came into our family, but in that room, at that table, with my husband. I set the photographs down very carefully on the desk. I did not knock anything over. I did not make any sound. I simply set them down on the green leather surface of Cormac's old partner's desk, and I looked at them for what was probably 2 full minutes without moving. Then I turned to the first document in the file. It was a handwritten letter. Not typed, not printed, handwritten, in a hand I did not recognize, on paper that had gone soft with age. The date at the top read, September 1987. The address was a solicitor's office on Pier Road, Kinsale. I will not reproduce the letter in full because some of its contents touch on matters that were, at the time, deeply private to the people involved. But the essential substance of it was this: a proposal. A community proposal for the acquisition and restoration of a derelict waterfront property on Pier Road, to be held in trust for the benefit of fishing families in the area who had been affected by a series of difficult seasons and, more specifically, by the loss of the cooperative processing facility that had been the economic backbone of several households in the harbor area. The letter referenced a founding group of contributors. Their names were listed in a formal notation at the bottom as signatories to the proposal. Cormac Joseph O'Sullivan was the third name on the list. The sixth name was someone whose surname I recognized but could not immediately place. A family name from the harbor area, Old Kinsale, one of those names that appears on the memorials and the old business signs and the parish records. And then it arrived, quietly, as these things do, the memory assembling itself from fragments. A conversation Cormac had once had at our kitchen table, years and years ago, with a man who had come to the house and whom I had served tea before retreating to let them talk. The name on the page was the name of that man's family. I turned to the next document. This was a formal legal memorandum, prepared by the solicitor whose name appeared on the letterhead, an older Kinsale firm, one I had encountered occasionally in my years here. The kind of small-town practice that handles wills and property and the accumulated legal necessities of settled family life. The memorandum detailed the structure of what it called the Harbor Road Trust, a charitable arrangement established under Irish law, with specific provisions governing the management of the acquired property, the distribution of any income from its use, and the conditions under which the trust could be wound up or its assets transferred. It was dated November 1987. The named trustee for the initial period of the trust was Cormac O'Sullivan. I read that 3 times. Then I read the rest of the paragraph. The co-trustees were listed as the solicitor, a local councillor whose name I vaguely remembered from that era, and, here was the word that stopped me entirely, a nominee to be confirmed upon reaching her 25th year, whose identity was known to the founding members and would be formally registered at the appropriate time. A nominee to be confirmed, whose identity was known to the founding members. I sat with that sentence in the quiet of my son's study, with the October morning moving slowly across the windows and the sound of a distant gull somewhere below toward the water, and I thought very carefully about what I was reading. Cormac had been a trustee of a charitable arrangement I had never known existed. The arrangement had been established in 1987, which was 11 years before Siobhan came into our family. Which was, I began to calculate slowly, the same year that Siobhan, born in 1970, making her 17 in 1987, would have been approaching the end of her secondary education in a family from the harbor area, from that specific Kinsale community that the trust had been designed to support. I kept turning pages. If you have ever reached the age where you understand that the people you have loved most were, in some fundamental sense, also strangers to you, not because they deceived you, but because love is not the same as knowledge, because intimacy is not the same as transparency, then you will understand what I mean when I say that the next hour was one of the strangest of my life. Not painful, not exactly, more disorienting than painful. The way it feels, I imagine, to look at a map you thought you knew perfectly well and discover that there is an entire district you have never noticed before, sitting quietly in the corner where you thought there was nothing. The documents continued. Letters. Minutes from meetings I had never known were held. Financial records, careful and clear, showing the flow of contributions into the trust and expenditures outward into the property restoration. A planning document submitted to the County Council in 1989. A report from a conservation architect assessing the structural condition of the Pier Road property. The same building in those photographs, I was now certain. And threaded through all of it, in various forms, the consistent presence of my husband. Not as a wealthy benefactor, not as someone acting from a position of surplus. The financial records were specific enough that I could see clearly what Cormac had contributed in the early years of the trust, and it was not insignificant relative to what I knew of our income and expenses in those years. We had not been wealthy people. We had been comfortable by the standards of the time, with his work in education administration and my university position. But what the records showed was that Cormac had contributed in the period between 1987 and 1994 an amount that represented a meaningful portion of what I thought had been absorbed by various household expenses he had always managed somewhat separately from our shared accounts. He had not hidden money. He had not done anything improper. But he had quietly redirected a portion of his own earnings, money that was genuinely his, that he had every right to use as he chose, into a community trust that was supporting fishing families in the harbor area of the town where we lived. For 7 years. Without, as far as I could determine from the documents before me, mentioning it to anyone outside the trust's founding circle. And he had never told me. I pushed back from the desk. I did not feel betrayed. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because I think it would be easy to misread what I felt in that moment. Betrayal is what you feel when someone uses secrecy to harm you. What I felt was something else, something more complicated and, in its way, more moving than betrayal. What I felt was that I was meeting my husband again, a part of him I had not known, a quiet, serious, private dimension of a man I had loved for 51 years and thought I understood completely. I was wrong. Not about his goodness, about the extent of it. I took a breath and returned to the file. The later documents were in a different hand. Chauvin's, I now recognized with certainty, that clear and careful upright script. They were dated from a much more recent period. The last 5 years, some of them. Notes, correspondence drafts, copies of communications with the County Council's Heritage Office and with the Charitable Trust Regulatory Body in Dublin. They concerned a question, a significant and apparently unresolved question, about the legal standing of the original trust documents in light of changes to Irish charity law that had occurred in the intervening decades. The property on Pier Road, the building in those photographs. It had been acquired by the trust in 1991. It had been partially restored. It had been used in various forms since that time. But certain registration steps that had been legally necessary under the newer regulatory framework introduced after 2009, had apparently not been completed, or had been completed in a form that the regulatory body now considered insufficient, which meant that the trust's legal standing was uncertain, which meant that the historic property it held, and by extension, the charitable work connected to it, was in a precarious position. I turned to the final document in the file. It was a letter, dated 6 weeks ago, from a solicitor in Cork City to Siobhan O'Sullivan regarding the current status of the Harbour Road Trust and the steps required to regularize its position with the charity's regulator. The letter contained one passage that I have thought about every day since I read it that October morning. It said, in the careful language of legal correspondence, that the most straightforward path to resolving the trust's status would be to locate the original nominee designated in the 1987 founding documents, the one described as confirmed upon her 25th year, and to formally register her role in the trust's governance, which had never been completed and which her formal registration would now make legally permanent. The nominee had never been formally registered, because nobody, apparently, had ever told her that she was meant to be. I closed the blue file. I sat in my son's study with my hands flat on the cover of it and the October light moving across the walls and the cedar cabinet standing silent against the far wall, And I thought about a 17-year-old girl from a harbor family in Kinsale in 1987, whose name had been placed in a legal document by a group of adults who believed they were protecting her future, and who had grown into the woman who managed a charitable trust that restored historic fishing cottages throughout County Cork, who had grown into my daughter-in-law, who had slipped a handwritten note into the pocket of my wool coat on a Sunday afternoon and asked me to find a blue file before anyone else did. And I thought, she knows. She has known for some time. And there is something else in this file, something beneath the legal documents and the correspondence and the photographs that I have not yet fully seen. I opened the file again and looked more carefully at the inside of the back cover where something had been tucked flat against the card, almost invisible. A smaller envelope, sealed. On the front, in Cormac's handwriting, a single word. Margaret. I have held many things in my hands across 79 years of living. I have held my husband's hand in the delivery room when our son came into the world. I have held the same hand much later, when he was leaving it. I have held the letters of students who wrote to me years after graduation to say that something I had taught them had mattered. I have held, in the difficult months after Cormac died, the particular emptiness of a house that has not yet adjusted to becoming a house for one. But I had never held a sealed letter from my dead husband that he had not told me existed. I want to be careful here. I want to describe what happened in that moment with precision rather than with drama, because the drama of it, the sheer improbable weight of sitting in my son's study on an October morning holding an envelope in Cormac's handwriting with my name on it, was already so far beyond anything I could have manufactured that adding theatrical language to it would only diminish it. The truth of that moment does not need ornamentation. It simply needs to be told accurately. My name, in his hand. On cream paper tucked flat against the inside back cover of a blue file I had found in a cedar cabinet because his daughter-in-law had placed a note in my coat pocket asking me to find it before anyone else did. 11 years he had been gone. 11 years and 3 months to be particular about it, because I am a woman who does not stop counting simply because counting becomes difficult. He died in July, on a morning in July when the harbor was very beautiful, and the light was doing that particular thing it does in high summer, that long golden Irish summer light that seems to arrive apologetically, as though aware of how long it has kept everyone waiting. He died at home, which was what he had wanted, in the bedroom where we had slept for decades, with the window open and the sound of the town below us and my hand in his. And I have never once, in 11 years, wished it had happened differently, because it happened in exactly the way he would have chosen if he had been given the choice, which, in some measure, he was. I turned the envelope over. The seal was intact. It had never been opened. Whatever Cormac had written inside it, no one had read it. Not in however many years it had been sitting in that blue file in that cedar cabinet in his son's house. Not Declan. Not Siobhan. Not anyone. Except that Siobhan knew it was there. She must have. She had directed me to the blue file. She had known its contents well enough to understand that someone needed to read them, and specifically that I needed to be that someone before whatever legal and administrative process was now pending, the regularization of the trust, the question of the nominee, all of it, moved forward without the understanding that this file contained. She had known the letter was there, and she had not opened it. She had left it sealed in her husband's house for a time she could not have predicted with certainty until the circumstances required that someone find it, and the someone she had chosen was me. I do not take that lightly even now. I did not take it lightly then. I set the envelope down on the desk. I pressed my palms flat against the surface of it for a moment and breathed. Outside, a car moved slowly up Compass Hill, past the house, continued upward. A gull called somewhere below toward the water. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary October morning in a town going about its business. Then I picked up the envelope and I opened it. The letter inside was 3 pages, handwritten, both sides of each sheet, in Cormac's particular script, that generous, slightly leftward-leaning hand that I had read across 51 years of shared life. Shopping lists and birthday cards and the margins of books, and once, a love letter he had slipped under my office door at the university early in our courtship that I still keep in a box in my wardrobe on Friar Street. I know his handwriting the way I know his voice, the way I know the exact weight of his particular silence when he was thinking seriously about something. He had dated the letter. The date was February 2013, 14 months before he died. He had known, by February 2013, that he was dying. Not with the sudden certainty of a diagnosis, but with the slower knowledge of a man whose body has been communicating its intentions for long enough that only the most determined forms of optimism could still resist understanding. He had not told me the full extent of what he understood at that point. That particular detail I did not learn until later from his doctor, who was a kind woman and who I think found the conversation as difficult as I did. But he had known. And in February of that year, he had written this letter and placed it in a blue file in a cedar cabinet, and, I could only assume, told Siobhan it was there. Why Siobhan and not me? That was the question I sat with for a moment before I began reading. Not resentfully, not with any sense of being excluded from something I was owed, but genuinely, curiously. Why had he chosen her as the keeper of this particular document? I think I understood by the time I had finished reading exactly why. He began the way he always began things, directly, without preamble, with the quiet confidence of a man who respected the intelligence of whoever he was addressing too much to spend time on unnecessary approaches. He wrote, "Margaret, if you are reading this, then Siobhan has decided that the time has come. I trust her judgment in this completely. She will have found the right moment, which means it is the right moment, and so I will speak to you as directly as I always have, because there is no longer any reason to speak otherwise." I set the page down after reading that paragraph. Siobhan has decided that the time has come. He had given her that authority, deliberately. He had written this letter knowing that he would not be there to deliver it himself, and rather than leaving it to chance or to some formal legal mechanism, he had entrusted its delivery to the judgment of his daughter-in-law, the woman who managed a charitable trust, the woman who had grown up in a harbor family in Kinsale and who had come into our family and who had, it was now becoming clear, a connection to Cormac's history that preceded her connection to our son by a significant number of years. I picked the page back up and continued reading. He told me about the Harbor Road Trust. He told me everything I had begun to understand from the documents in the file, but in his own voice rather than the language of legal memoranda, and that made it entirely different. He told me that in the autumn of 1987, he had been approached by a man named Padraig O'Brien, a fisherman's representative from the harbor area, a serious and decent man who had been watching the slow economic erosion of several harbor families with increasing alarm, with a proposal for a community restoration project. The old building on Pier Road had been empty for years. Its owner, an elderly man with no direct heirs and a long connection to the harbor community, had been persuaded to transfer it to a charitable arrangement that would restore and maintain it for the benefit of the families who had depended on the maritime economy of that stretch of coast for generations. Cormac had said yes immediately. He wrote, "I did not hesitate, Margaret, and I want you to know that. I did not agonize over it. I did not calculate. I have thought about that many times since, about what it means that I simply said yes without a moment of doubt. I think it means that there are some things the heart knows before the head has finished asking its questions, and this was one of those things. Those families needed something that I was in a position to help provide. That was the complete sum of the decision." I had to stop reading again for a moment, not because I was upset, because I was so precisely, so absolutely not surprised by that passage that it made something ache in my chest that I do not have a better word for than recognition. 51 years I had known this man, and that paragraph was him entirely. The absence of calculation, the instinctive alignment of resources with need, the plain, uncomplicated ethical clarity of it. I composed myself and continued. He explained the financial contributions. He was honest and specific in a way that surprised me even then, even knowing him as I did, because there is a form of honesty that requires courage even in private communication, even in a letter that will only be read after you have gone. He told me that the amounts he had redirected toward the trust between 1987 and 1994 had come from a portion of his salary that he had managed separately, as I knew he did, and that he had not told me about this particular use of that money because he had been afraid. He used that word, afraid. He wrote, "I was afraid that you would think less of it than I did, or that you would worry about the amounts. You were careful with money, Margaret, in the best possible sense. You understood that money is not a thing you can replace once it is gone, and you were right about that, and I respected it enormously. But I was afraid that if I told you the amounts you would ask me to reduce them, and I was not able to reduce them, and I did not want us to have an argument about something that I felt so quietly certain about. That was not a good reason for the secrecy, and I have always known it. What I should have done was simply tell you and allow you to respond as you would have responded. I believe now, looking back, that you would have understood. I believe now that you would have understood." 11 years too late to tell him that he was right, but right nonetheless. There is something I want to say here, and I want to say it as plainly as I can, because I know that some of you listening to this have sat with your own versions of that feeling. That particular combination of grief and retroactive reassurance that arrives when someone who is no longer here reaches across the distance and tells you something that, if you had known it sooner, might have made both of your lives slightly lighter. Cormac had carried the weight of that secrecy for 26 years. He had carried it alone, which was unlike him in most other respects, because he was a man who shared things. He shared thoughts and observations and small domestic joys with an openness that I have missed every single day since he left. He had kept this one thing private, and it had cost him something, and he had finally said so in February of the year before he died. If this story is touching something in you, if you find yourself recognizing some version of these quiet family distances, these silences that accumulate over years between people who love each other, I want to ask you to take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Not because this story is mine to keep, but because there are more of these stories to tell, and telling them to an empty room serves no one. Every subscription means another person sitting with these questions, and these questions deserve company. The third page of the letter was the one that changed everything again. Cormac wrote, "Now I must tell you about Siobhan and about why I have trusted her with this more than anyone else, and why that trust is not a diminishment of you, but a reflection of something I need you to understand before the trust's business is finally settled. Siobhan Nimerchu, her name before she became Siobhan O'Sullivan, was 17 years old in the autumn of 1987. Her father, Seamus Nimerchu, was one of the harbor fishermen whose family had been most significantly affected by the loss of the processing cooperative. He was a proud man, Margaret. I do not use that word as a criticism. His pride was the kind that makes a man work twice as hard rather than accept what he considers charity. And I respected that form of pride even when it complicated things. He would not have accepted a direct contribution from the trust, nor would he have accepted anything that could be construed as assistance directed at his family specifically. So we did not direct it at his family specifically. We directed it at the future. What Cormac explained, across the careful paragraphs that followed, was that the founding members of the Harbor Road Trust had included in their original legal structure a provision for a designated nominee, someone who would, in time, take a formal governance role in the trust's management. The nominee had been selected by the founding group with Seamus Nimerchu's quiet, unofficial knowledge, though never with his formal acknowledgement. The nominee was his daughter, Siobhan, then 17. A young woman who, even at that age, had demonstrated an unusual clarity of mind, a practical intelligence, and a depth of commitment to the community around her that several of the founding members had independently noticed and remarked upon. Cormac had voted in favor of the nomination without hesitation. He wrote, "We could see even then what she would become, not with the arrogance of people who think they can predict the future, but with the humility of people who recognize capacity when it is standing in front of them." She was 17, and she was already the person she is now. Some people are like that. The years add knowledge and technique, but the essential person is established very early and does not change in its fundamentals. Siobhan Nimurchu was one of those people. She still is. He paused in the letter. I could feel the pause, the way you can feel a pause in the writing of someone you know very well, a slight shift in the rhythm that means the writer stopped for a moment before continuing. Then he wrote, "She does not know the full extent of her nomination. She knows that her name appears in the original documents. I told her that much several years ago after she came into our family, and I understood that the time had arrived for at least a partial truth. But I did not tell her everything. I did not tell her about the provision that links the nominee's formal registration to the final disposition of the Pier Road property. I did not tell her because the legal question was not yet urgent, and because I was, perhaps, still the man who preferred to manage things quietly rather than distribute all the complexity at once." He paused again, and then, "What I should have done, Margaret, what I should have done years ago and did not, was sit both of you down at the same table and explain the whole of it. You and Siobhan, the two women I have trusted most completely in my life. I should have told you together. I should have made it a shared thing rather than keeping it divided, keeping you each with a partial understanding that was never the whole." I set the third page down on the desk. I looked at the cedar cabinet. I looked at the garden through the window, the October garden, with its late roses and its stone wall. I looked at my husband's desk, the partner's desk built for two, the double-sided thing that implies collaboration. And I thought about what he had just told me. Siobhan had known for some years that her name was in the original documents, but she had not known the provision connecting her formal registration to the property's legal future, and I had known neither of those things until this morning. But Declan. What did Declan know? I leafed back through the blue file. I read more carefully now, looking for evidence of Declan's involvement or knowledge. And gradually, from the phrasing of the more recent correspondence, Siobhan's correspondence with the solicitor in Cork, her careful and slightly oblique references to the family context, I began to understand. Declan did not know about his father's founding role in the trust. He did not know about the nominee provision. He may not even have known that Siobhan's family name appeared in the original documents. He knew, presumably, that the Harbour Road Trust existed as part of his wife's charitable work. It was adjacent to the kind of work her organization did, plausibly connected, not necessarily conspicuous, but the deeper history, the 1987 founding, Cormac's years of contribution, the nominated role. These were not things Declan had been told. And now I understood why Siobhan had not opened the letter herself. She could not open a letter addressed to her mother-in-law any more than she could simply walk into a room and announce to her husband that his dead father had made quiet financial contributions to a community trust that had subsequently shaped her own life's work. These were not revelations she could deliver. These were things that needed to arrive from the right direction, through the right hands, in the right order. She needed me to be the one who brought it. I finished the letter. Cormac's final page was brief, characteristically brief, in the way of a man who understood that the most important things do not require extension. He said that he had arranged, through the solicitor on Pier Road, who still held the original documents, for a full accounting of the trust's history to be made available upon his death. He said he had assumed that accounting would be requested by whoever dealt with his estate. It had not been requested, perhaps because no one had known to request it. He said that he was sorry for the secrecy, and that he did not think sorry was adequate, but that it was what he had. He said that he hoped, when this was finally known, that it would be received not as a revelation of something hidden, but as the completion of something that had simply been interrupted, the way he always put it. The completion of something interrupted. He signed it the way he signed all his letters. With love, from someone who wishes he had a little more time to finish things properly. I folded the 3 pages back into the envelope. I held it for a long moment. Then I set it carefully on top of the blue file, and I sat in the study of my son's house with the October light coming through the tall windows and the cedar cabinet standing solid and dark against the far wall. And I thought about a woman who had been nominated, at 17, to steward a piece of the community that had shaped her, by a group of adults who had seen something in her before she had seen it in herself. I thought about a man who had given quietly for 7 years to something he believed in completely and had never asked for acknowledgement. I thought about the legal letter from Cork, sitting at the back of the file, describing an unresolved provision and an unregistered nominee and a property in uncertain standing. And I thought, this is not finished. This has never been finished. It was simply waiting for someone to read it all the way through. I checked the time. I had perhaps 40 minutes before they would return from the harbor breakfast. I returned the blue file to the cedar cabinet. I placed it exactly where it had been, slightly to the left of the alphabetical order, outside the system, in the particular place where Siobhan had left it findable without making it obvious. I put Cormac's letter in the inside pocket of my wool coat against my chest. Then I sat in the wingback chair, not Declan's desk chair, the other one, the old chair that faces the window, and I waited for them to come home. Because there was something I had not yet resolved, something that had been sitting at the edge of my understanding since I had first looked at those photographs. The 3rd photograph, the office table, the 5 people. Cormac, the unknown man, the 2 women I had not recognized, and Siobhan. But I had looked at that photograph 3 times now, and each time I had looked at it, I had noticed something that I had not yet allowed myself to fully think about. There were 5 people at that table, and I had accounted for 4 of them. The 5th person, the one whose face was turned slightly away from the camera, the one at the far end of the table who was partially obscured by the angle of the shot, was someone I had not been able to identify clearly. But there was something about the way that person held themselves, something about the line of the shoulders, the particular set of the head, something that scratched at the edge of my recognition without arriving there. I needed to look at that photograph again. And there was one more thing I had noticed, only on my 3rd reading of Cormac's letter, that I had not fully absorbed in the emotion of the first 2 readings. He had mentioned a solicitor, the original solicitor on Pier Road who held the founding documents. He had used a name. I knew that name, not from Cormac's telling, from somewhere else, from something more recent, something that had been sitting quietly in my memory since the previous autumn, waiting for context that had not yet arrived. I sat in the chair by the window and I listened to the town going about its October morning below me. And I waited, and I thought about where I had heard that name before. They came through the front door at 11 minutes past 11. I know the exact time because I was sitting in the wingback chair by the study window when I heard the gate latch, and I looked at the clock on the mantelpiece, the old brass carriage clock that had been Cormac's mother's and that Declan winds every Sunday morning without fail. And I noted the time the way you note things when you are waiting, and time has become something you are paying close attention to. I had been sitting in that chair for nearly an hour. I had not moved the blue file. I had not rearranged anything in the study. I had sat very still with Cormac's letter against my chest, inside the pocket of my wool coat, and I had thought, carefully and methodically, about what I now knew and what I still did not know, and what I intended to do with both. I heard Declan's voice in the hall first. He was speaking to someone on his telephone, a work call, from the tone of it, the particular measured cadence he uses when he is discussing something professional. Then the call ended and I heard the sound of his coat being hung and his keys set on the hall table. Then I heard Siobhan. she came directly toward the study. Not hesitantly, directly, as though she had known, from the moment she came through the front door and registered the particular quality of the house's quiet, that I was there. I wonder now whether she checked the cedar cabinet first, before she came to find me, whether she saw that the blue file was still in its place and understood from that alone that I had read it and made a decision about how to proceed. Chauvin is the kind of person who reads a room, reads a house, with remarkable accuracy. It is one of the things I have always admired about her. She appeared in the doorway of the study, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment that was longer than it might appear from the outside. She looked tired. I had not seen that clearly on Sunday, because Sunday she had been managing everything. The lunch, the conversation, the careful choreography of an afternoon designed to hold something at bay. But here, in her own house on a Monday morning with the performance over, she simply looked tired, the kind of tired that is not about sleep. I said, "Sit down, Chauvin." She sat, not in Declan's chair. In the smaller chair on the near side of the desk, the one that faces the window, which meant we were sitting side by side rather than across from each other, which I think was the right arrangement for what we needed to say. I took Cormac's letter from inside my coat, and I placed it on the desk between us. She looked at it. She looked at my face. She said very quietly, "You opened it." I said, "He addressed it to me." She nodded slowly. And I saw in that nod about 12 different things at once, relief and something like grief, and the particular release of a person who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. She said, "I didn't know what was in it. I want you to know that. He told me it was there, and he told me it was for you, and he asked me to decide when the time had come. But I never opened it." I said, "I know." I could see it had never been opened. She said, "I should have found a way to tell you sooner." There were several moments in the last 2 years when I nearly did. When the solicitor in Cork first wrote to me about the trust's status, I sat at that desk, she nodded toward Declan's chair, for an entire evening trying to work out the right words. I could not find them. I understood that completely. Some truths resist the words we try to put around them. They require approach from an unexpected angle. They require, sometimes, a handwritten note and a coat pocket and a Sunday afternoon. I said, "Tell me what you know about the 5th person in the photograph." She went very still. That stillness told me more than any answer could have, in the first second of it. It told me that there was a 5th person, and that she knew who it was, and that this was the part she had not yet decided how to tell me. I waited. I have always been good at waiting. 31 years of teaching literature will do that for a person. You learn that silence is not empty, that it has a texture and a direction, that if you simply hold it without filling it, the other person will eventually speak into it. She said, "The woman whose face you can't quite see in the photograph. The one at the far end of the table." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is my mother." I heard Declan in the hall, moving toward the kitchen, the sound of a cupboard opening, the familiar domestic sounds of a man making himself a cup of coffee in his own home on a Monday morning, entirely unaware that in his study, 11 years of incomplete history was finally finishing its own sentence. Chauvin's mother. I thought about that. I turned it carefully in my mind, looking at it from different angles, the way you turn a document you are reading for the first time and hold it to different lights to see whether the watermark changes. Chauvin's mother had been in that room in 1987, had been part of that meeting, the meeting at the solicitor's office on Pier Road, where the formal structure of the Harbour Road Trust had been discussed and the nominee had been designated. A woman from a harbour family, the wife of Seamus Ní Murchu, the proud fisherman who would not accept direct assistance, but whose wife had sat at that table. And Cormac had not mentioned her in the letter. I said, "Why isn't she in the letter?" Chauvin looked at me with an expression that was, I think, the most unguarded I had ever seen on her face. The composure she carries so naturally was still there at the edges, but the center of her expression was simply open, simply honest. She said, because my mother asked him not to include her. She was there, that day, without my father's knowledge. She had gone to the meeting because she understood what the trust was trying to do and she wanted to support it. But she was afraid of what would happen if my father found out that she had been involved in anything connected to what he considered charity directed at their family. She paused. And then, she was the one who suggested my name for the nomination. Not Cormac, not Padraic O'Brien. It was my mother who put my name forward. She told them that if they wanted to build something that would last, they needed to put someone young at the center of it, someone who had grown up with it and would grow into it. I sat with that for a long moment. A woman who had walked into a solicitor's office in 1987 without her husband's knowledge, in a town where everyone knew everyone and privacy was a thing you constructed carefully rather than assumed, and had sat at a table and put her 17-year-old daughter's name into a legal document because she believed in her daughter's future more than she feared the consequences of being found out. I thought of Cormac's letter, the absence of calculation, the instinctive alignment with what was right. He had recognized that quality in Chauvin because he had first seen it in her mother. I said, "Is your mother still living?" Chauvin said, "She is. She is 81. She lives in Clonakilty now, with my sister. She has known for the past several months that the trust's legal situation has become urgent. She has known that the question of my formal registration as the nominee would eventually need to be resolved. She has been waiting, in her own way, the way she has always waited for things, without rushing them, without forcing the moment before the moment is ready. She looked at me. She said, she told me, when I told her what I was considering doing with the note, that Cormac's wife would know what to do with it. She said that she had only met you a few times, at the wedding, at Declan's firm's anniversary dinner, at the Harbor fundraiser some years back, but that she had watched you in those moments and understood that you were the kind of woman who could hold complicated information without either dismissing it or being destroyed by it. I did not know what to say to that for a moment. Then I said, "She is a perceptive woman." Chauvin almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. We sat in the quiet for a moment more. And then I said, "We need to tell Declan." She said, "I know." I said, "Today." She said, "I know." She looked at the door. She looked back at me. And she said, with the directness that I have always respected in her, "I did not tell him before because I did not know how to explain what I understood without explaining all of it. And all of it required you first. It required someone who knew Cormac well enough to receive what he had done the way it deserved to be received, not as a secret, as a story that had simply not yet reached its ending. I picked up Cormac's letter from the desk. I held it for a moment. Then I handed it to Chauvin. I said, "Read it now, before we speak to Declan. I want you to know what he said, all of it, because some of what he said is about you, and you deserve to hear it." She took the letter from me with both hands, the way you receive something from someone when you understand that the receiving of it is a significant act. She unfolded the pages and she read. I did not watch her face while she read. I turned toward the window and I looked at the garden and the late October light on the stone wall, and I let her have the privacy of her own response. She read without making any sound. When she had finished, she refolded the pages very carefully and held them in her lap. She did not hand them back immediately. She said, without looking at me, "He writes the way Declan talks, when he thinks no one is paying very close attention." I said, "I know. That was always the truest version of both of them." She said, "He was very certain about things, not arrogant, just certain, in a way that made you feel more certain yourself." I said, "That is precisely what he was like." "Yes." Then she handed the letter back. I put it in my inside pocket again. And we both stood up, and we went to find my son. Declan was in the kitchen, as I had known he would be, standing at the counter with his coffee and his phone, looking out the window toward the back garden with the expression of a man who is between tasks and has not yet decided which one to move to next. He turned when we came in, and he looked at the two of us, at our faces, our posture, the quality of how we were standing together in the doorway, and I watched the change move across his expression. He is his father's son. He read the room as quickly as Cormac would have. He set his coffee down. He said, "What's happened?" I said, "Nothing has happened, Declan. Something is being finished. That is quite a different thing." We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, around the old pine table where we had eaten Sunday lunches for 20-something years, and I told him, not quickly, not with the abbreviation of someone delivering a summary. I told him the way a story like this deserves to be told, from the beginning, in order, with the full weight of each thing given its proper place. I told him about the note in my coat pocket. I watched his face when he understood what Siobhan had done and why, and I watched the complex mixture of things that moved through him in that moment, something that was not quite hurt and not quite relief, but some combination of both, the feeling of a man who has been slightly outside a story that involved people he loves and is only now being brought fully inside it. I told him about the cedar cabinet, about the blue file, about the founding of the Harbor Road Trust in 1987 and his father's role in it, and the years of quiet contribution and the nominee provision and Siobhan's name in the original documents. I watched his face when he understood that Siobhan's connection to his father's charitable work had preceded her connection to him by years. That Cormac had known something essential about the woman his son would eventually marry before Declan had known it himself. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "He never told me." I said no. He said, "Why didn't he tell me?" I said, "Because he was the kind of man who protected the people he loved by managing things quietly. It was his greatest quality and his most significant limitation, and he knew both those things about himself, and he said so in the letter he left for me." I took the letter out, and I placed it on the kitchen table in front of him. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then he picked it up and he read it, there at the kitchen table, while Siobhan made tea without being asked to, and I sat and watched my son read his father's words for the first time and tried to hold my own feelings in a way that would give him the space to hold his. When he finished, he set the letter down very gently. He looked at Siobhan. He looked at me. And he said something that I have thought about every day since, because it was so exactly what Cormac would have said in the same position, with the same information, at a kitchen table on an ordinary October morning. He said, "So what do we do next?" Not, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Not, "How could this have been kept from me for so long?" Not any of the smaller, more self-referential responses that a person would have had every right to. Simply, "What do we do next?" I said, "We go to the solicitor in Cork. We get the trust's registration completed properly. We make sure that the Pier Road property is legally secure and that Siobhan is formally registered in the role that was designated for her 36 years ago by the people who saw her clearly before she had the full chance to see herself." He nodded. Then he said, "And my father's contribution, the financial records. Is there anything that needs to be resolved there?" I said, "No. Your father gave from his own earnings to something he believed in. That is not a complication. That is simply who he was." Declan looked at the letter one more time. Then he looked at his wife, and he said quietly, "You should have told me sooner." She said, "I know. I was finding the right beginning." He said, "You could have started anywhere." She said, "I know that now." It was not a resolution, that exchange, not a full reconciliation compressed into a moment. Those things take longer, and they both knew it, and I knew it, and we all sat with the imperfect honesty of it without trying to make it neater than it was. That is the thing about real families. They do not resolve in a single scene. They keep going, imperfect and ongoing, and full of unfinished conversations that circle back and try again. But, It was a beginning. A real one. 3 weeks later, we drove to Cork City together, all three of us. Siobhan's mother, Breed, came from Clonakilty with Siobhan's sister, and we met at the solicitor's office, a different firm from the original Pier Road solicitor, who had retired many years since, but a firm that held the archived documents and knew the full history of the trust. Bridney Murchu was 81 years old, and she walked into that solicitor's office with the bearing of a woman who had been waiting a long time to finish a piece of business and was not going to be delayed any further. She had her mother's eyes, as Siobhan had hers, that particular clear, direct gaze that does not look for approval because it has never needed it. She shook my hand when we were introduced properly, after all those years of brief encounters at family gatherings, and she held it for a moment and she said, "Your husband was a good man, Mrs. O'Sullivan." I said, "He was. I am still finding out exactly how good." She smiled at that. The smile of a woman who understood completely what I meant. The legal process took most of the morning. Documents were examined and authenticated. The original nominee provision was confirmed and its requirements assessed. A formal application was prepared for submission to the charities regulator to bring the trust's registration into full compliance. Siobhan signed her name in the place that had been waiting for it since 1987, on a document that her mother had helped to create before Siobhan herself had been old enough to sign anything of consequence. When it was done, we stood outside the solicitor's office in the November Cork City morning. The five of us, Declan and Siobhan and Brid and her daughter and me, and nobody said anything grand. Nobody made a speech. Brid put her arm through her daughter's, and Declan put his hand briefly on my shoulder, and we walked toward a restaurant 2 streets away where we had booked a table for lunch. I walked alongside Brid. She is a small woman, sharp-faced, with the particular energy of someone whose body has aged more than their mind and who finds this mildly irritating. We walked at a pace that suited us both, not hurried, not labored, simply the pace of 2 older women who have somewhere to be and are not in any particular rush to stop thinking on the way. She said to me as we walked, "I thought about telling you many times over the years. I nearly wrote to you once, after Cormac became ill, but I did not know how to begin without making it about the wrong things. I said, you began it at the right time. You sent your daughter into that solicitor's office in 1987 with your name on the document and your conviction in your hands. That was the beginning. Everything else was just the story finding its way to its own ending." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He told me once, your husband, that he believed the best things people do for each other are the ones they do without needing the other person to know who did it. That the anonymity was part of the gift." I never entirely agreed with him about that. I said, "Neither did I, but I understand why he believed it." She said, "A woman wants to be known, even if she cannot always be thanked." I said, "Yes, even if she cannot always be thanked." We reached the restaurant. Declan held the door. We went inside. That evening, I walked back along Silly Walk alone. It was a cold November evening, fully dark by 5. The harbor lights doubled in the still water below. The fishing boats at their moorings. The old fort on Summer Cove, a dark shape against a darker sky. I thought about Cormac, about the man who had given quietly and deliberately for 7 years to a community he lived inside and loved in a particular specific way. Not abstractly, not sentimentally, but practically and with full attention. The man who had looked at a 17-year-old girl from a harbor family and seen not someone who needed assistance, but someone who would one day provide it. I thought about Breed, walking into a solicitor's office on a morning in 1987 without telling her husband, because she understood that the future required a quiet act of faith from someone, and she had decided to be that someone. I thought about Siobhan, carrying the partial weight of this story for years, finding the right moment with the patience of a woman who had been trained, from before she fully knew it, in the long discipline of waiting for the right time. And I thought, families do not fall apart because love disappears. I have said that before, and I believe it more completely now than I did when I first understood it. They lose the courage to finish conversations. They protect each other sometimes by keeping things divided. One person holding this piece, another person holding that one, nobody holding the whole picture, everyone managing their portion alone. What the blue file had done was give the whole picture back to everyone at once. Not as a revelation, as a completion. I am 79 years old, and I have been a widow for 11 years, and I am still learning things about the man I was married to for 51 of them. I find that I do not experience this as a sadness, though I understand why someone might expect me to. I experience it as a form of continued companionship. As long as there are things still to be discovered, he is not entirely finished. The note is still in the pocket of my wool coat, not Siobhan's note, that one I gave back to her the day we sat in the study together, but Cormac's letter. I moved it from the inside pocket where I carried it that day to the outer pocket, the deep one, where my hand finds it when I am walking. I do not read it often. I do not need to. I simply know it is there. And sometimes, on an evening walk along the harbor, when the lights are coming on, and the boats are coming in, and the town is doing what it has always done and will keep doing long after all of us have finished our own particular stories, I put my hand in my pocket and I hold the folded pages for a moment. And that is enough. That has always been enough. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in Margaret's journey, in Cormac's quiet generosity, in Siobhan's patience or Brid's courage, has reached something real in you, I want to ask you to leave a word in the comments. Just one word if you like. The word that describes what you would have done if you had found that note in your coat pocket on an October evening. Would you have gone back? Would you have waited? Would you have left the file exactly where it was and chosen not to know? There are no wrong answers, only honest ones. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, this is the moment I am asking you to do that. Not because of an algorithm, not because of numbers, but because these stories exist to be shared between people who still believe that the most important things happen quietly, between ordinary people, in houses that look from the outside like everyone else's house. Subscribe so that the next story finds you the same way this one did. Ready, and listening, and willing to sit with something true.